You normally couldn't say this, but I think I can today. We'd all rather be in here than out there. First of all, let me just say something from some written notes, and then I'm going to be pretty extemporaneous after that. As every one of you knows, pension systems are constantly evolving. They respond to market and political forces. They respond to federal and state court decisions. Our legislative bodies are not static organizations, they are dynamic organizations. So are our chief executives at the state level. And so we have changes that occur in the systems. Some are well thought out, some are not so well thought out. Because of these changes in my state, retirees, depending upon the year that they started state service or local service, because we actually cover almost all public employees in the state, they are in one of three different plans with numerous different options under which to retire under those plans. To understand how we came up with this hybrid plan that people talk about, I think one of the things I need to do is to do a little bit of discussion, a little bit of presentation on the history of our system. And then I'm going to go through some slides that you all have to point out some of the issues that we have within the system. And then I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about some of the reforms that we may still consider to the system. And then I guess we're going to go on to the next speaker. Oregon's system dates from about 1945. It was a relatively simple system. It was what we called money match. It's not the typical like 401k. Basically, an employee put in approximately different percentages, but ultimately ended up being 6%. Their account grew by the amount they put in, by the investment earnings from those monies put in, and they actually accrued at what the presumed rate of return was for those investments. Because Oregon, like many states back during those days, was pretty frugal in how they made investments, and pretty short-sighted, actually. They made investments totally in things that had very low returns. So that by the 1960s, people were retiring with very low retirements. The PERS board at that time decided that they would put in an annuity and pension formula system. Fairly simple system again. People received 1% of their average annual final salary, and then they received annuity simply based on the actual balance in their individual account, not matched by the... For a very brief time there, the PERS board did away with money match, and then almost simultaneously put it back in place. If they hadn't done that, I wouldn't have half the problems I have to deal with now. So we went on. Pensions still remain fairly, well, really not what we wanted to have for employees in the state. They were still relatively low. So we decided to put in a floor, or the PERS board decided to put in a floor. I was pretty young back then. And so they put in a full formula system. In the full formula system, employees actually earned a certain amount per year based on their final salary. But they had to make a choice between their money match possibilities, their formula plus annuity possibilities, and this new full formula. That actually worked relatively well, and people thought that our system was going quite well. Actually, in 1968, for the first time, it was allowed for some of our investments to go into public equities, and that's what helped part of that effort. However, by the 1990s, we were having significant earnings in the system, in these accounts, very significant earnings in these accounts. You all may know that Oregon is not the birthplace to the initiative, referendum, and recall system, but it is said that we have perfected it. So that rising level of money match retirees that were retiring at larger and larger percentages of their final salary led to an initiative being put on the ballot. That initiative attempted to do three things. It got rid of the assumed rate of return on the individual's account. It got rid of what we call the employee's pickup. I really didn't cover that, but for the employee's pickup, 70% of employers now, or not 70% of employers, but 70% of employees have their employee's portion picked up by their employer. This actually dates back to the late 1970s, early 1980s, when there were some issues over the taxability of contributions into these plans, and it also dates back to the very bad economic times that we all had back in the early 1980s. And it became a collective bargaining item. And so during those difficult times, rather than giving employees increases in salary, what they basically did was started to pick up their coverage. Well, the measure passed by 50.04%. It was immediately challenged in court. Ultimately, the court threw out every single item in the measure. While we are known for our initiative system, we are also known, but not outside of the state, for the vigorous activity in our court system in almost all areas. And this is one of them. One of the things that happened in terms of challenging this measure was it sent a pretty clear message to the legislature that they could do very limited things for existing employees and hardly anything for people that had already retired to reduce liabilities. But what they could do was to basically change the system for new employees. So in 1986, we put in place what we call Tier 2. Tier 2 no longer has the assumed rate of return for those employees. And it's still eligible for money match, but there is very little chance that those parties will ever be eligible for money match. And also with some changes we made in 2003, there is literally no possibility that they'll be eligible for money match. Well, after these changes were made back then we got to the end of the 90s. And in the end of the 90s, the PERS board continued to credit individuals' account with actual earnings level and not the assumed rate of return. The assumed rate of return is 8% at that time, still is 8%. And so in most cases, they credited more than double that. In fact, during a 4-year period, if you had an account that had $100,000 in it, you would, at the end of a 4-year period, if we had kept the original provisions, you would have had $196,000 in that account in a 4-year period. It would have grown by 96%. The last increase to that account was challenged by local governments and was reduced to 11.33% versus 20%, which meant you only had $186,000 in that account, not the 190 plus. So we came into 2003 knowing that we could not actually maintain our liabilities. We did a number of different reforms. One of them was we reformed the existing system. The PERS board, which we had always had issues with, was largely made up of PERS members. And so we made the majority of the board non-PERS members with actually specific qualifications to serve in those positions. We also instituted new actuarial tables. The PERS board had been using actuarial tables from the late 1970s, which meant as we gave out money match retirements, they were giving out much larger retirements than what they should have been based on current actuarial tables. We also limited the PERS board's ability to credit more than the assumed rate, and they made two changes which I don't think were very well thought out to basically change the annual rate of return on those individual accounts guarantee from annual to lifetime, and to do away with the 2% COLA which we have. to make up for some of our shortfalls in the system. Why I say they were not good is we were told at the time those changes were being made, both by our Legislative Council and Attorney General, that the Supreme Court would overturn both of those changes, which they actually did under the basic clauses in our Constitution. It should be understood that since 1973, our courts have basically determined that employees have a contractual right, a unilateral contractual right, to whatever retirement system they entered into when they started as an employee at the state or local level. So that's why we're very limited in our changes. Also, beginning in 2002, the state and local governments started to issue pension obligation bonds. Those that issued them in 2002, 3, and 4 did relatively well. Those that issued them in 2007 are sarcastically living with the consequences because they lost most of those funds that they, or not most, but of a large percentage of those. Now I think what I'd like to do is talk just a little bit, very briefly, about a couple of aspects of the system. One is that we have a very diversified way in which we actually invest PERS funds. And two, our PERS board has no role in investing those funds. Those funds are invested through the Treasury and the Oregon Investment Council. 43% of our funds go to public equities with a prescribed or target rate of return of 9.3%. 16% go to private equities with prescribed or desired rate of return of 11.5%. 25% go to fixed income with a expected return of 5%. 11% go to real estate with an expected return of 8.4%. 5% go to alternatives, and 7.7% go to, that's a 7.7% return, which equals out to about an 8% return. Before I go into these slides, I'd like to point out one thing, though. You will hear a lot of discussion here about pension liabilities relative to health care. For all practical purposes, we have none. We have two small programs, one that gives a flat benefit to Medicare-eligible retirees of $60 per month, the other one that affects about 1,100 employees that are pre-Medicare. Those total programs only cost about $34 million a year to fund. There's literally no long-term liability within those programs.
Excuse me for interrupting, but did I hear you say that you don't have basic health care for your retirees?
No.
You do not?
Do not. Now, it doesn't mean that individual governments haven't done that, but the state does not. This first slide here just gives you an idea of the system. There's 232,000 active and 113,000 benefit recipients. Can you go on to the next slide? I'll do this pretty quickly. Okay, this slide is pretty complex, but you will see the gradual change in the age of retirement eligibility. Those have actually significant impacts on liability. So even though with significant periods of service you can retire earlier, your actual average retiree is retiring much older. Also in these, I would point out a couple of things. One is that you will see actually as you get down here on the full formula, while it wasn't changed with Tier 1, it was changed with Tier 2 to a lower level. If you go to the next slide, in this, these don't look very significant here, but they are in terms of what's credited towards final salary. If you look here, you'll see for Tier 1, which are long-term people pre-86, they get about everything credited. Then you get a little bit less credited. Then the new people get nothing literally credited other than their salary. Those have significant impacts. Go to the next slide. You can see in terms of our active employees in Tier 1, the numbers have declined significantly. We only have about 14,000 at the state level, 17 at local government, 21,000 for school districts. So our number of Tier 1 retirees is declining significantly. And as you can see, in terms of total numbers, we have 52 active in Tier 1, 52 active in Tier 2, and we have 88,000 active in our new system. Next slide. This is the history of our overall funding. Point out there in 2001, 2002, the losses in the system, and then point out 2008. That is actually a 27% loss in total assets in the system. Let's go to the next slide. Historically, since 1970, about 7% of the cost of the system has been paid by the employee contribution, 22% by employers, and 71% from investment returns. Next slide. In 2007, we were at 112% of liability. When we lost 27% of our assets, we dropped down to 80% of our liabilities. You can see we were gaining, but actually we had a bad year in '81 and didn't earn our presumed rate of return. We only earned about 2%. So our liabilities actually increased again, and we're down to about 81% now. Next slide. This is a very demonstrative slide. These are actually the liabilities of the system. 58% for retirees, 27% for Tier 1, and the remainder for everything else. I like this slide. This is the only reason I include this. The next slide. This slide, this is zero-based, so I'm not trying to lie to anyone here. As you've all seen slides that are not zero-based. That's what our losses look like in 2008. Next slide. Here's what I'm trying to actually point out in this. Yeah, it's not right there. See, in '96, 24% earnings, they credited 21. In '97, 20%, they credited almost 19. '99, almost 25%. They originally credited 20. That was brought down by a court decision to 11.33. Accounts almost doubled in that period. The next slide, and we'll go back. This is just some of the data on that. And then if you can go to the next slide, this one. This shows you some of the history. In terms of long-term employees, back in the 1990s, these are 30-plus year employees. They got about 61% on average of final salary. That built up because of that extra crediting in the late 90s, up to long-term employees receiving an average of 100% of their final salary. Now it has actually declined back down to 74%. We expect it to continue to decline, probably back down into the mid-60s somewhere. And you can see for our other retirees in the state that are not long-term, our average is about 22 years of service. They have dropped down to historical levels of about 50% of annual salary. Next slide. The top slide is money match. This is the sort of the bubble. You'll see that it was up to almost over 80% of, on average, of long-term retirees. And most retirees actually, it's now back down to under 60%. And you can see that money match, which was declining at the same time down to practically nothing around 2000, is now up over 40% of retirees that are going formula rather than money match. Next slide. This shows you actually, in terms of 30-year employees, are now retiring at about 74% of final income, and regular employees are retiring at about 50%. Next slide. Nobody ever talks about these. These are our retirees. You can see that 68% of our retirees receive less than $3,000 a month in retirement. The next group of about 27% is between 3 and 6. The only ones the newspapers talk about are the 554 there that actually are in the highest income categories. Next slide. These are the actual PERS rates for employers. You can see historically they were about 11. Now there's some disguise here within this slide. In about 2003, you can see that the average rate with side accounts and the average rate without side accounts was always the same. The side accounts are actually the pension obligation bonds, And those pension obligation bonds brought rates down. Of course, the governments have to pay back those pension obligation bonds. You can see the higher rate there was instituted in 03 for 05, 07. That was not the rate they actually paid. They were significantly lower than that, and there's a note about that. Then one that is my problem, because I complained about this when it happened. Look at how much the rate dropped when it was set in 2007 for 2009. It was set based on the odd-numbered year. We already knew what had happened in 2008. But given the fiscal condition we were in, nobody except for maybe me wanted to continue to pay at the higher rate. Because now what we face with the losses in 08 is you can see how much our rates may go up in this coming biennium in 13-15. And I think that's about isn't that the end of the slides? Our further possibilities for reform are somewhat limited. And actually, while being limited, they are also somewhat problematic. One of the things is that we are in extremely difficult fiscal times. Our budgets for the state and our general fund lottery fund, which is our discretionary fund budget, we would have had to have about an $18.5 billion budget in the current biennium that we're in order to fund services. We're funding at about 14.7 now. So my school districts have $500 million less than they had in 07. Community colleges have the same budget they had in 2001. Higher education's 2003. Healthcare costs have gone through the roof, so our human services budgets continue to expand. There's not too much we can do in our public safety budgets we can limit their growth, but the fact is, like everybody else, we've had a history of mandatory sentences, largely through the initiative system, so our costs are kind of in place there. So if we actually had to pay that higher rate, which we might actually have to pay, the impact is going to be rather devastating in this coming biennium. We're only expecting moderate growth in revenue. But almost every change that you can think of that we have left has its problems. We can reduce the assumed rate of return, which is now 8% for the system. If we do that, long term, probably because of the people that are retiring money match, long term, it's probably a savings. Short term, it's an increase. Because if we assume a lower rate of return on those investments, then our liabilities actually grow, because we're not assuming that on our existing assets we can actually have as high of a return. We can try to engage in some activities that we know that the courts will throw out. There are, though, a few things that we might consider. We could adjust the pickup that we have for employees. As I said, 70% of employees across the state and local and school district are having that pickup paid. So we could actually start to require more of that to be paid by employees. That would probably in many cases affect collective bargaining on some of those issues. But the odd thing is most governments would like to put that money back into other things, but to actually transfer where these rate increases will go, that's where the money would have to go. It would just keep down their net cost. We could actually tighten what we call a collar. The PERS system actually has put in place a collar so that they can't raise rates more than 3%. That's actually 3% of payroll if we are above 80%, or if we are above 80%. If we're below 80% of liabilities, they can raise them by 6%. We can tighten that collar or ask the PERS board or instruct the PERS board to do that. But if we do that, we will lower existing costs to employers, but we will increase probably long-term costs. But the reality is we may not have any other option. We could attempt to abolish the COLA. And just what we could do with that, we could attempt to do it. The courts would overturn it. We would pay it back. And we would pay it back with interest. Not a very good thing. Our system is so complex right now that I really don't want to develop a fourth system, because whoever is my predecessor who has to get up and try to explain this is probably not going to be able to. Our new system for employees is a pretty basic system. It's not an overly generous system, and I don't think actually that our current fiscal situation should be taken out on our new employees that actually do have a fairly reasonable pension system. In closing, the only thing I'd like to say that, again, that as we all know, that pension systems are evolving, not static. If you get involved in with this, which I think you all have become, I hope that you have the best legal counsel that you can obtain, and I hope that you have the best actuarial support that you can maintain. And in both cases, please don't get people that want to agree with you, because you need to hear the entire story, because what you do can come back to bite you. Think long and hard about the changes you would make. If the PERS board back in 1968 hadn't reinstituted money match, we would only have probably tier 1. And the state would have probably had, the state and local governments would have had billions of dollars more, billions and billions of dollars more to devote to services. But that's where we are now. Thank you.